but they weren't necessarily evaluated during the scale-up, and a lot of things might have changed. So it's important for to be effective scale-up that it is actually successfully achieving its objectives, and that's based on evidence. The second point is adaptability, that the initiative can move with the different contexts or different target groups or different sizes that it's addressing, because again, the pilot may be one thing, but how it's scaled is different. So can it move and shift? So that's another important feature. Third big one, and we often hear about it in relation to scale up, is sustainability, so that it is sustainable, can be maintained over time. And one of the key features of effectiveness that we found that two forms of scaling up are particularly important to work together for sustainability are horizontal scale up and vertical scale up. And what that means, horizontal would be your geographic, physical, quantitative expansion, while the vertical scale up would be institutionalization and policy reform. And those two working together can really help support sustainable scale up. So these were the 4 features we identified of effective scaling up. Now, even if you meet those definitions, there are other features that can affect the likelihood of your effective scale up or your scalability, the potential to effectively scale up. And these are described essentially in 2 categories: external factors and internal factors. Your external factors are conditions and features that are and institutions, entities that are external to the initiative and to the scaling entity. And the scaling entity is the body that is leading the scale up. Internal factors are those that are stemming directly from the initiative's design, the scaling up strategy, or the scaling entity. So they separate into 2 groups. And we identified this again through the literature review, which was both looking at theory, but also actual cases of effective scale up and the features that have influenced them or not across CCDRR, DRR more broadly, international development, health, education, also quite influential, nutrition, WASH. And as you look at the screen, what you see is on the external side, key enabling factors that would enable the support of the environment, and if they're not there, potentially disable the likelihood for scale up. Political will, support, and or buy-in from the initiative from local and national authorities. Supportive policy environment, this could take different forms. It might be laws. DRR might have been mainstreamed into curriculum. There could be organizational, institutional policies prioritizing the initiative. Leadership and or a champion for the initiative, and that could be plural as well. Local and multi-stakeholder partnerships engaged with the process, and also the timing of the scaling up. When is it actually happening in time? There are a couple of interesting initiatives from childhood development education that pointed out the initiative scale up may not have been successful. It had happened 10 years earlier or 10 years later. So there's lots of factors that can influence it from the external side. On the internal, we identified a series of points as well. The initiative actually needs to address a perceived need. And one of the things we thought about during the process that we'll come to touch on later is who is perceiving that need? Is it the organization that is implementing the scaling up? Is it the affected population? Is it the government? Is it everybody? And so thinking about that is, who has perceived the need, and is it supporting the need for the initiative? The scaling entity involved has adequate human resources, capacity, or plan for capacity building to support the scale up. Scaling up is included in the initial planning and design of the piling ups. Planning from the beginning was a common point. Scaling up process is gradual rather than rapid. While some people did want, some initiatives want to push for quick, actually the gradual was proved to be a potentially enabling factor in an effective scale up. The initiative is simple or has potential to be simplified, and that's quite linked to the adaptability point from earlier. The process has an adequate budget and is affordable, and obviously what is affordable will be different for different initiatives. Scaling entity and or stakeholders have a shared vision. What's the goal? We actually had examples of initiatives where there was not a shared vision, the scale up did not work. And the initiative is linked to incentives. Now these could be monetary or non-monetary. So these were the features that were identified as creating an enabling environment, or in their absence, a disabling environment. It's also acknowledged that these will vary somewhat between the initiative and context, unlike the features outlined here, which are much more fixed. These really are the cornerstones of effective scaling up. Now, in terms of actors and pathways for scaling up, we also had to think about that in terms of our concepts. As I mentioned, we identified scaling entity as the institutional organization that seeks and is expected to adopt and implement the initiative to be scaled up. That could be the organization that piloted the project, but they could have also handed it off to somebody else. Somebody else could have picked it up. And it can be any different sort of entity, governmental, non-governmental, an alliance, a network, a combination. Common examples that we identified in CCDRR was an initiative piloted and then expanded by the same entity. For example, the Red Cross. They piloted nationally and then expanded internationally, and they would be the scaling entity. You have initiatives piloted by an NGO, but are intended to be implemented or scaled up by the Ministry of Education, for example, or another government entity. And then there are initiatives jointly scaled up by the NGOs and the Ministry of Education. These were common examples we came across because we were specifically looking at CSS, CCDRR, but there would be many other forms it could take. In terms of the right side of the screen, these are our pathways. This is the route you can take to scaling up. And as with everything else in the literature, there's a lot of different terms and expressions, but these are the three most common pathways. And sometimes they're used as synonyms for scaling up, particularly replication, but they're actually three separate processes. Expansion, which is intentional and planned scaling up of the initiative by the piloting entity. And that's a big distinction between expansion and replication, because replication is the intentional planned scaling up by the piloting or another entity that is reproducing the tested project in additional places with different groups. This doesn't mean it's a photocopy and it's just a copy-paste template initiative somewhere else, but there are what we call hard or essential aspects of the initiative that are unchanged, and there are soft, adaptable components that are being tailored to the context. So that's what's intended to happen in the replication process. Then you also have spontaneous scaling up, and this is where an initiative undergoes expansion or replication, but is unplanned by the piloting entity. It was not intended. We came across several examples of that where an initiative was designed, it was piloted or tested, sometimes by practitioners, sometimes by academics. Someone noticed it, picked it up, and did something with it, but it wasn't linked to a planned process that had to do with how it was designed. And one thing that we did also see that a hybrid combination of these pathways, maybe expansion mixed with replication, maybe spontaneous came in there, could be not only possible, but sometimes preferred. And it would all depend on the type of initiative. In terms of planning and measuring for scale up, what these concepts and defining these concepts gave us were critical features and factors that we could use to develop a framework for measuring scalability. The idea of a checklist or a way to somehow record or test scalability is not new in international development. There are some famous ones from health. There's one from ExpandNet WHO in particular that's got a lot of attention. MSI developed one for general international development that's also been widely used. So we learned from those, but we took the concepts that we developed that I've just walked through to really build a framework that was really more specific to CCDRR, and taking all the lessons we could from the literature and using that to build what we're calling the scalability assessment and planning toolkit, the one that we tested that Isabel will talk about in a moment. There are a number of different components that we built into this toolkit to help people in the field plan, think about, and assess scalability and scaling up. It opens with what we're calling the no-go checklist, which essentially is a couple of key points you can answer yes or no to, which will help you answer whether or not you're even in a position to be having the discussion. One of the most important features of that, for example, will be, has the pilot been evaluated for effectiveness? If it has not, you need to go back and do that before you can move on, because one of the key features of the effective scaling up is that it has been successful based on evidence. The toolkit also provides an overview of scalability, key terms, and some links to where you can find some more information. There's a draft agenda for a workshop and guidance on workshop length, facilitators and participants, and what to think about in putting together an SAP workshop. The toolkit is designed to essentially be used in a workshop format. You could use pieces of it in other ways. Program managers could take part of it to check out what's going on, but the ideal situation is that it is done through a workshop. the bulk of it is, of course, the series of worksheets for the workshop. And these help you identify and think about what are the most appropriate types and pathways for undertaking the scaling up. And we had interesting outcomes, as Isabel will speak to, in the pilot, where people had thought they wanted to go one way, but actually now that they were asked some specific questions that were laid out in the toolkit, they realized they wanted to go a slightly different way. There are two key scoring sheets. One is about what we're calling the deal breaker criteria, and that's again the 4 criteria that were outlined for the definition of effective scalability, asking you to score them, and then if you score below a certain point, you need to take corrective action. It is absolutely required if you plan to scale up. There's a similar sheet for internal and external factors. Again, you score it, and if you score below a certain point, this is a Likert scale of 1 to 5. So basically, if you score anything from a 1 or a 2, which is expressed below, you have to think about what you need to do. Unlike deal breakers, you don't absolutely necessarily have to take a corrective action in order to proceed with scaling up, because external and internal factors might be more variable depending on the context. But you are asked to think about it and actually write out what you would do about it. The worksheets also help you map out those internal and external factors. If that hasn't been done already, for example, if you don't have an education snapshot that might have already outlined these for your team. And finally, there's a template for how to report on the workshop, and it's not intended just to be an exercise to report and to get sent off. It actually helps you pull all the findings from the assessment together, the common scores, what's the outcome. And the idea in when that was developed, it was not only help plan the scale up, and help you monitor the scale up, how to respond to needed corrective actions, but potentially also include it in a funding proposal if that was desired to demonstrate the thinking moving forward. And with that, I will hand over to Isabel, who can talk a little bit more about how we tested this toolkit in the field.
Okay, thank you, Anna. So it's loading, I guess you can see now. So I'm going to discuss the trial, the pilots in the field in India and Bangladesh. So they both took place last year in September. For the field work, I was supported by, as we said before, by research associates, one in each country. In India, the 2 initiatives that had been preselected by the SAVE team after a quick go-no-go exercise were the Disaster Management Resource Center and the Child Champions. And in Bangladesh, the initiatives that were preselected to go through the SAP tool were the School Safety Planning, but for secondary schools, and the urban risk assessment process. So there were the 4 initiatives preselected to go through the whole testing. So before the workshop themselves, and with the support of the research associate and the SAVE staff, we conducted a few key informant interviews and group discussion on those initiatives, and this is quite important for us to conduct them prior to the workshop to better understand the initiatives themselves, collect preliminary data, and get some external views on them as well. Sorry for my phone. So because in one of the cases there was no snapshot available. So about the workshop themselves, they were both 2-day workshops, and the participants were selected and invited by the SAFE country offices themselves, but based on very specific instruction that the SAP process requires. First, need people who have a good knowledge of the initiatives to be assessed, people with good knowledge of the external context in which the initiatives could be scaled up, and the third type of people should be relevant representatives from the entities that are most likely to lead or be involved in the scaling up. In both cases, at the end, we mostly got participants from the first and second categories. In India, we started with 20 participants, but we finished with 14 on the second day because of many other commitments. And most of the participants were from Save the Children and the local partner. And but we had on the first day, we had 2 representatives as well from the Department of Education that attended the workshop. In Bangladesh, we started with 12 participants, which was a mix of Save the Children participants and other INGOs representatives. By the end of the workshop, there were only 8, because at the time there was a big beginning of the big Rohingya emergency in Bangladesh, so some of the people couldn't stay. During each workshop, participants discussed and debated the issues and questions raised in each of the steps and in each of the worksheets that are the main tools of the SAP tool. And we used group work, plenary discussions, and presentation. Overall, each workshop was divided approximately between 60% group work, 30% discussions and plenary, and 10% only on the presentation of the theory and the content of the SAP process. So the few highlights from the workshop, the pilots. So as I mentioned, we went through the whole process in 2 days. It was very heavy work for all. We were very tired, but we managed to do it. And based on individual and group evaluation, it was very well received. I mean, the steps, the worksheets, the exercise, the materials were very well received and valued by the participants. They felt they understood much better what is scalability, effective scaling up, and the different types of pathways it can take, and how much the context is crucial in scaling up. They found that the results of the workshop, what they came up with, provided them with a very strong foundation from which they can develop a scaling up plan, including very critical corrective actions they have to take before continuing with the scaling up. But another point, in all the 4 initiatives that we worked through, I mean, monitoring and evaluation was identified as the main challenge for assessing scalability, but as well for scaling up. And overall, monitoring and evaluation could be the main weakness for effective scaling up. This is a point that needs to be taken very seriously. So as well, the participants identified lessons and recommendations to improve the overall SAP process. And most of those recommendations have already been integrated into the new version of the toolkit that will be available very soon to you. And but the main recommendation was to allow more time for the workshop itself, ideally 3 to 4 days when possible. So that's it for me. I'll give back the mic to Anna.
Thanks, Isabel. While my presentation screen is reloading, we're about to launch into conclusions. If anybody has any questions about anything that's come up for themselves or of anything we've discussed so far, please feel free to start writing them into the chat menu, and others in the team will start reviewing the questions so we can launch into Q&A nicely, smoothly at the end. So now in terms of the conclusions of the research, Leslie mentioned at the outset, we developed a matrix. And from the catalog we got from the literature, we looked at practice-oriented literature and identified a number of different CCDRR and non-CCDRR, including non-DRR tool initiatives to have a full mix. We had approximately 60 of those, including the 4 that were workshopped in the pilots. Now, using 2 key inclusion criteria, one, that they had to have sufficient information to be able to answer at least what we're calling the deal breaker questions, those 4 areas of the effective scaling up definition, and had enough information to indicate that the initiative had been evaluated for effectiveness in achieving its specific objective. So those were 2 inclusion criteria. The numbers dropped from 60-something to 25. So we actually examined in very close detail these 25 initiatives. We subjected each of those to all of the questions on the scalability assessment for the deal breakers and for the internal external factors. And in order to deal with subjectivity, because it is quite a subjective process, or it can be a subjective process, we did cross-checks within the team. So, for example, Isabel would check 10% of my work, etc., so that we had a balance and find that we actually weren't scoring it too differently, but there were some areas that we could then discuss and revise. And it was this matrix that we then used to really feed into our findings, as well as the overall feedback we were getting from the workshops and other reflections. This matrix included both the qualitative numbers, the scoring we gave to each, but also explained qualitatively why we arrived at that score. So it was both quantitative and qualitatively assessed. So we return now to our 4 main research questions that Leslie outlined at the beginning. The first is, what is scaling up and scalability with relevance to CCDRR? Well, as you remember in the beginning, I spoke about how we came up with 2 definitions, scaling up and effective scaling up. And scaling up is only as good as this initiative is effective. So we go back to our criteria for effective scaling up, and the definition is put up here again, that it is characterized by successful, adaptable, and sustainable initiatives that are iteratively incorporating M&E throughout the piloting and scaling up process. We also had other good practices that we identified, such as I mentioned, that for sustainability, horizontal and vertical scaling up ideally could be combined, and maybe you have to start with horizontal and move to vertical because the conditions aren't there but may form part of your planning, and to think about what kind of pathways you want to use and how. These are all good practices. We also identified, as I spoke about, these deal breaker features, the 4 factors of the effective scaling up definition. These are your prerequisites for scaling up. If they're not there, you need to introduce corrective actions before moving forward. That was one of the key findings in terms of understanding scalability. And then, of course, our enabling environmental factors, the internal and external factors that I spoke to before. So this is the concepts that framed question 1. It was very much about what are these items, how do we define them, and why. Question 2, what are good practices for successful scale-up of CCDRR, including CSS pillars 2 and 3? And so here we're back to the toolkit. We have our deal breakers, and we have our enabling environment factors. And this helps us identify, again, with some of the good practices I mentioned before on the previous slide, in terms of thinking about all of your deal breaker features, how you address enabling environments. The SAP is intended to guide and to help you think about these features. So these are your core platforms for good practices. And we looked at it through the lens of CSS pillars 2 and 3, and these were all common points that needed to be considered. What CCDRR and CSS initiatives are most appropriate to scale up? So in that matrix slides, one of the things we also coded and examined were specific characters that are specific to CSS. In particular, we looked at classroom or delivery settings, such as in a classroom or outside of a classroom, teacher role in delivery, as well as the level of curriculum integration. Was it extracurricular? Was it fully incorporated into the curriculum? We had a number of different features that we described allowed for curriculum integration at different levels. And to see if there were any differences, we also looked at medium of delivery. Was it through traditional, paper or tech-based or web-based, or so we look at a number of different factors, as well as the different types of initiatives. We had different forms of CCDRR initiatives happening in different countries, ranging from Italy to Belgium to Africa, countries in Africa, countries in Asia and Southeast Asia. We had a number of different delivery institutions, governments, NGOs, Red Cross, UN, academics. So we looked at a lot of different pieces, and when we put it through the SAPT, we found that actually there's no single most scalable type of initiative, and that those scoring moderately or highly against deal breakers criteria and enabling environments are those most appropriate to be scaled up. And we looked at that by looking at case studies of what had been demonstrated to be effective scales up over long term, meeting the full definition, as well as medium examples. We looked at that based both on documents as well as key informant interviews. So no specific initiative stood out as like this type of initiative is best. And as you can see on the left, so the high scorers, we had ranges of curriculum integration levels. There was sometimes context dependent, not always specific forms of delivery mechanisms. However, we did see some limited patterns in the low scorers, that overall extracurricular non-teacher-led initiatives scored lower. In terms of enabling environment factors or internal and external factors, as I mentioned before, this varies between initiatives and contexts. However, one point that was clear that was across all initiatives was the critical importance of support from national, regional, and or local authorities. That support could take place in different ways. They could actually be the scaling entity. They could take a role with the NGOs or other actors in planning. There could be a positive laws that they're working on to support the policy environment, but that piece of it was very important. We also identified one very strong common weakness across initiatives with either limited, weak, or absolutely no monitoring and evaluation. And this was, even for initiatives that had been documented and recorded as very successful for scaling up, they still had challenges with M&E. Others had no M&E at all. They were scaling up without ever having been evaluated. And we saw that in the literature. I mean, not among the initiatives we assessed, because we wanted something that had been evaluated in some way. There was also discussions of challenging your assumptions of just because something has been scaled, it doesn't necessarily effective. But M&E was really critically highlighted as an area that needs a lot more attention. Two other areas of the SAPT that we argued merit more attention because they were not having enough information to really score, but as well the way it was talked about in the workshop, people not necessarily being so sure. Comparative advantage and ownership as two areas to give more attention to, and potentially in further research, and potentially thinking about more as well in how it relates to the initiatives that you're planning for scaling up. And finally, on question 4, what are the most effective means to design, develop, and prepare to deliver scalable initiatives in CCDRR, including CSS? So we're proposing that the toolkit, either as the toolkit itself or the process it proposes, is the best way forward. It's, as I said, it starts with a go, no go, which allows you to say, is this even worth my time to talk about? Are we even ready to talk about scaling up? And then if you said yes, you can move on to planning for the SAP workshop. And then it walks you through the 4 steps. So first you want to actually understand what scaling up, scalability is all about. You want to start thinking about, okay, so what kind of scale up am I thinking about? What types and pathways am I ready to be thinking about, both horizontal and vertical? If so, yeah. If so, how does that look? If no, why? What can I do? What are the implications of that? What pathways do I want? Within pathways, there's all, and you'll see this in the report, those of you that go ahead to read it, the different subcategories and different ways you can do expansion and replication. And this was apparently very interesting in the workshop. They really liked all the different ways they could think about it, all these different options that they could suddenly explore and combine as well, not just one or the other. Then step 3, conducting the assessments, and step 3 and 4 are basically both the assessments, conducting your deal breaker assessment and scoring that. What are your corrective actions? You know, what has to be done? And then step 4, you're conducting your assessment on your enabling environmental factors, your internal, external factors. And again, if you're storing under 1 or 2, what might you need to do? How essential is it? And also outline what that's going to look like. You know, what is the problem? How are you going to deal with it? And to actually think that through as a group as part of the workshop. And then you pull it all together as part of the workshop report. And with that, you can, as I mentioned before, you can actually launch those corrective actions for scaling up as part of your process, as well as setting other milestones. And sorry, there we go. And these milestones. So when you think about planning for scale up, the diagram that's in front of you, now this was based on our general reflections from the process. This was not something that we can say was, it's illustrative. It was based on the triangulation that we did. So this is just an example of how you can think about planning for scaling up. You wouldn't necessarily have to stick to this timeline exactly. It's just meant to start to get you thinking. But if you think about the left side being where you start to think about your idea for your initiative, and the right end is you've actually effectively scaled up the initiative. What are the steps you need to think about as you go through? and how do you line them all up? So we start with your first milestone, you've piloted it. Then you've evaluated that pilot, okay, you have an effective initiative. So then you want to do the workshop to help you plan for it, plan for your scale up. And part of that you may have identified, okay, these factors in the environment need to be prepped for the scaling up. We need to identify partners to build a platform. We need to work more with the government to get them prepped. Maybe that will help build into vertical scaling up that will allow for institutionalization. You start thinking about that, allowing yourself several months to build up that process. Maybe advocacy needs to take part. And also to be thinking further down the line at milestone 5, funding being secured. Do you have the money to actually deliver the scale up? When is that secured and how does that process go? So this diagram is to help you think about that process. The proposed time scale might be appropriate for your initiative. It might not. You might want to take a bit more time. You might want to secure funding sooner rather than later. That the way in which, depending on which enabling factors need to be prepped, might also influence that. And on that, I will hand back over to Marilise for the recommendations coming back out of the report.
Thank you, Hannah. Let's just see if we can reload here. Okay, so moving on to the recommendations. I'm not sure if you can actually see the screen. Has it moved on? There we are. Moving on to the recommendations. Okay, so based on the findings of this research, we have presented a number of recommendations, of which there are 5 key ones. And so we recommend that Save the Children and its partners take the following steps. First, the first of these is we recommend that Save review its CCDRR and M&E systems. So that's to ensure that any initiatives that are planned for scaling up are evaluated for effectiveness. As Hannah and Isabel have both pointed out, effective M&E is really, it's considered a prerequisite or a deal breaker for scalability. Second, we recommend testing the SAP toolkit in a wide range of contexts and obviously documenting those results. And this could be done by Save the Children and potentially by other GADRES partners. Our third recommendation concerns updating. So following the further testing that we recommend, the toolkit should be updated to incorporate that feedback and the observations from that process, as should the SAP matrix. Our fourth recommendation concerns actually using what's been learned through this research to achieve greater impact. So we recommend that every 2 years, a specific strategic initiative is selected by SAVE and its partners for wider scale-up. And finally, in the spirit of generating and sharing knowledge, we're recommending SAVE to work with GADRES to set up a virtual forum, a kind of discussion space where practitioners and researchers working on scaling up can share their research, their success stories, their lessons and challenges. And in our view, this should include a blog on scalability, as that's a really good way to engage people informally and to keep this discussion live. And so with that, let's move on to any questions that you may have. I see that we have already a question from Kiersey. So I'm going to share that one first and ask members of the IRMA team if we can help to answer that. So Kiersey, you say, as a duty bearer, we should always try to get government involved if we expect results at scale, ideally at the policy level. But in Fiji, you say, teachers point out that there have been 18 new policies in 3 years, which is overwhelming. So any ideas on how to overcome this challenge? Isabel or Hannah, I was wondering if you might be able to help us respond to that question.
Sure, I'll dive in there. It's difficult to answer without some more specifics, but I think in terms of the good practice, we identified 2 main points come to mind. One is the ability to, or what your options are to plan with the government from the beginning as an advocate partner in the initiative, and then be able to work with them on the corrective actions on how those changes in policy are affecting the enabling environment, how critical are they to the initiative, and what are the implications, and if it's able to be, the initiative can adapt to how those move and change, if that's just how it is part of the environment. Is it a matter of how the initiative is designed, or is it how the government is a partner in that initiative? At what point have they been brought in? But without knowing a bit more about the specifics of the initiative in question and the policies and how they relate, it's hard to get into more detail.
Thank you, Hannah. I think Dorian is also asking a question. So perhaps we can wait for that one, or if anybody else has one in the meantime, please put it in the chat box. So Dorian is asking, every country has its own context and challenges, but does the toolkit include recommendations on how to overcome some of those main challenges, or links to other resources, like how to build interest in national or state stakeholders? I think I have a feeling that the answer to that one would be the same or very similar, in that if you work with those stakeholders from the very beginning, then generating that shared ownership, then any challenge becomes a joint challenge rather than an obstacle. Perhaps anyone else from the EMA team would like to add to that?
No, I think that's the main point. I think as well that there isn't a general answer beyond what Marilis has offered for how to interest national and state stakeholders, because who those stakeholders will be and what role they would have with the initiative will be varied by the initiative and the context a bit. You know, for example, for many context, budget would be one of those main challenges. But in some contexts, for example, there's one CCDRR initiative in Indonesia where the budget is not an issue because the curriculum integration of DRR has taken place and there's an allocation. So they have other challenges. So one can't assume that the common challenges are faced by all the initiatives. What the toolkit does ask you to think about each of those challenges. How does it manifest in the context that you're scaling up? What could be done about it? And then again, to reiterate Marilis, the ownership and planning from the beginning are really quite important enabling factors. And the sooner you can bring those in, the sooner you're working with those entities throughout the process. Thanks,
Hannah. And of course, the more context in which the toolkit is tested, then the more learning there will be about how to address challenges. So this is really something that you can work on by applying the toolkit in a really wide range of contexts.
Precisely, Marilis. This is Leslie. I was thinking that we could actually, in a next rendition of the toolkit, we could consider different annexes that would actually give resources such as those that Dorian is looking for. So that would be a nice enhancement to the toolkit eventually.
Great, thank you, Leslie. And Dorian, yes, thank you. Good. We're glad we helped to answer that to some extent. Do we have any other questions coming from participants?
I have one. It's Kate here, and keeping with the theme of enabling environment and support for government at all levels. In your research, you said that support from government was an important feature. Did you go as granular to see if different levels of government provide greater scalability outcomes? So say if you connect and partner with national government, you'll get more of a scalability result as opposed to local.
I can answer that. It depends on, and it depended on what was the scaling up objective of the initiative in question. Was the initiative aiming for national level and potentially international scale up, or was scale up simply a matter of moving from the village to the region? So there was one initiative for our Save the Children initiative that was literally just moving from the sub-regional to a regional level. So they were doing some outreach with the national, but obviously the regional authorities were very important. And they hadn't planned for further scale up beyond that yet. There are other initiatives that were very clearly from the beginning intended as national, and so the national government had to be involved from the outset, and that was absolutely critical. So this again goes back to the planning from the beginning question: what is the ultimate goal and how do you achieve it? And that doesn't mean you're going to be able to get the government on board and get institutionalization, policy reform there from day one, but maybe you need to plan for it. Maybe you need to think about your 5-year strategy to get there. Some initiatives looking at advocacy towards that over time. So it really comes down to that. And if you go through the bibliography, if anyone's interested, we can pinpoint a few specific cases. You'll see different initiatives that we looked at, and you can look at that. They're named in the report, both from CCDRR, but also early childhood development was another one we looked at quite a bit because it has parallels and had additional good studies for that worked in different ways on that front.
Thank you, Hannah. Do we have any other questions from participants? Perhaps anybody who's been involved in scaling up an initiative recently and has some challenges ahead, or anyone who would like to share a question that's been you've been thinking about for a while that you hope this research might be able to answer?
I have another one, sorry. I'm being a bit lazy and not typing it in the box. And it's looking at our overall objectives for the research program. So we're trying to move away from that project mentality to more of a program mentality. And I was wondering if you could explain how the SAP toolkit helps practitioners move away from thinking in terms of the project cycle to achieve scalability.
Okay, Hannah or Isabel, would you like to share anything on that front?
No, I think in its nature, I mean, we often think of projects as much more limited time bound. So we're thinking about our 12-year project tied to, 12-month project tied to maybe a 12-month funding cycle, or 18, 24-month, 3 years max. And often you need to think about scaling up. If you're thinking about what is our real goal with the scale up, we actually have to think about what is our goal for 10 years. And it might be thinking about how you graft that initiative onto the other programs, become maybe kind of a cross-cutting, how you're thinking about slow growth over time. So I think that if you're truly planning about scaling up from the beginning, from your pilot, from your initial planning and design process, you're forced out of the time-bound, to some extent, the initial budget-bound structures of the project mindset. Whether or not you call it a program mindset or just a bigger box, I think those are different people would use different terms, but I think the nature of doing it effectively and following the good practices, at least that we've identified, would force you out of the smaller box of what we would normally call a project, and that you couldn't just hit repeat on the project once that funding cycle has ended and start again, because it needs to have some sort of link and thinking about how it grows or replicates and why.
Thank you, Hannah. And maybe a couple of other thoughts on that. One is that to use the results of this research to discuss with donors and potential donors about the importance of thinking beyond the typical 12-month time frame in order to give that potential for scale up. And also working with others. So when one organization's that might be piloting an initiative, for example, when their time frame is up and the funding is over, if that experience has been shared more widely amongst partners in a particular country, then another entity that becomes the scaling entity might be able to take that forward. So there are different ways to move beyond that very fixed project time frame that's beneficial for scaling up.
And just to add on to that, the other feature is the issue of vertical scaling up, which, as I mentioned, using vertical and horizontal together is recommended good practice, particularly for the sustainability component. That really forces you out of the project mindset, because that's a whole other process, and it may involve really long-term government reform, policy reform, to really get it built into the system in different ways. That could involve a mainstreaming component, long-term thinking about curriculum integration. there are a lot of factors in that that really force you out of that shorter term mindset.
Good. So I think we may have time for one or two more questions if there are any. I know some of the participants have had to leave, so perhaps we can just give a last chance for a last question or a couple of questions if anyone would like to type it into the box. In the meantime, any other points that the team or Kate would like to add? Okay, I think that we've probably exhausted the questions. Kate, I'm going to hand back over to you to round up and to thank the participants.
Thank you. The toolkit will be available as well as all the reports, and that will be going up on the GADRS website, but we will be sharing that quite widely internally, particularly to everyone who has been invited to the webinars, so stay tuned for that, and perhaps once it's available, and if you're interested in testing it in your country, we can work with you on that as well. So from this point, I would like to thank Leslie, Marilise, Isabel and Hannah for your time. I know you're all on very different timelines and it's quite late for some of you, so thank you. And thank you for everyone for joining the call and for asking questions. The recording of this call will be shared through Workplace as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint, so stay tuned for that. Before you log off, just to help us improve our research webinars, we have quite a few coming up. We just have two little poll questions. So I'll just get the first one up on your screen now, and if you could answer that, that would be great. So I'll give you maybe a minute to just select that. Yes, I can see some answers coming in now. The question is, the webinar was informative and well presented. So you just select. Great. And we'll just get the next poll up on the screen. And you should be able to see that. And this one is asking, I will be able to apply the research to my work. So if you just select which is appropriate for you. Great, I can see those answers going up now. Excellent. So that's all from us. Thanks again for joining, and if you ever have any feedback or questions about this research, feel free to reach out to me or to ask anything on the Education Safe from Disasters Workplace page. Thank you everyone, and have a great morning, afternoon or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.